Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with the wise will become wise." I'm Dan Chappa, and Turton Fan and I have been friends for many years, and we've learned a lot from each other, including how to debate opposing views while loving the person. We share a foundation in the essentials of the Christian faith and a love of God and His Word. Here we'll dive deep into the Bible and present both Calvinism and Arminianism and the precise points of disconcurrence. Hopefully the contrast will bring you clarity. Welcome to Disconcurring Theo Amigos. Hi, Turton Fan. How you doing?
Doing great. How about yourself?
It's always good to see you.
Likewise.
Yeah. So just recapping from last episode, we were dealing with especially Ephesians chapter 1 and the concept of predestination that's discussed there, especially in verses 5 and also in verse 11. And the question came up of, well, there's other uses of predestination, proorzo, in Acts, and we wanted to discuss those as well and maybe do a little bit of a deeper dive into word study and how it's used in those different passages. So if that sounds good, I guess let me just do a quick recap of what we talked about in Acts, and then we can launch right into a quick recap of what we talked about in Ephesians on predestination, and then we can launch right into Acts. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
All right. So I'll share my screen out. Just a sec. Okay, and I'm going to bring over the PowerPoint slide from last time. So let me know when you can see a PowerPoint slide.
I see it.
Okay, cool.
Actually, I
So,
see the whole PowerPoint, to be honest. Anyway,
oh, that's cool. Well, I guess I can go
I
into
mean, it's up to you. It's all good from my standpoint.
yeah. Here. Down and just grab some real estate. Okay, that should work. Okay, so what we last talked about is some Arminian views of predestination. What is predestination on the Arminian view? And I analyzed it in two different aspects. There's the object of predestination, like who or what is predestined, and then also I analyzed it on how is predestination accomplished. So we'll look at those. But just to recap quickly, the object of predestination in Ephesians is personal, it's us. In Acts, what we're going to see is it's mostly about an event, the crucifixion, rather than people, although in some sense Christ is predestined, and that's talked about in Acts. But so when you look at it from an object of predestination, there's some people that are corporate, or at least primarily corporate, and they have predestination as secondarily individual on the Arminian side. And then some are more classic Arminians, where they have a foreknowledge based election and predestination that's secondarily corporate. So there is a group aspect, but the group is made up of individuals that God foreknows will believe in Christ. And then on that foreknowledge base, there's, again, it's broken down into two groups. One where perseverance is foreknown, and then there's me, where conversion is foreknown. It's foreknown who's going to come to Christ, but their perseverance is predestined. So, and then as far as how predestination is accomplished on the Arminian view, there's two different views. One is it's deterministic, and the other is it involves free will. And on the deterministic side, there's a concept of will setting. It's kind of like a habit. Or maybe it's like let's say a drunk driver, right? The person makes a choice to drink, but once they're drunk, maybe they can't do otherwise than they're doing, or something like that. Or another example is sleeping. You're not supposed to sleep during your test, but while you're sleeping, you can't you can't actually answer your questions correctly because you're asleep. Will setting is kind of the same concept. Then the other side is freely, and it's middle knowledge, or some version of God knows what you would do, and then he just uses that middle knowledge as part of his plan, as part of predestination. And the other is it's much more flexible. It's corporate. It's a group where members can be swapped in and out. Now, I said that to say this. Since we talked about in Acts that the object of predestination is different. It's not us that's being predestined. Rather, it's basically events around the crucifixion. And that's also going to be accomplished differently. It could involve middle knowledge, or it could involve some flexibility. So let's start with Acts chapter 2 and verse 23. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definitive plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Okay, so we have the definitive plan and foreknowledge of God. And definitive plan isn't, it's orizo, but it's not pro orizo, but it's the same concept. It happened beforehand. Um, so the most common Armenian explanation of this is a couple things. But the idea is that the delivery over to sinful men was the plan, right? God foreknew that certain individuals wanted to crucify Christ, and he gave Christ over to them, knowing what they would do, and then they went ahead and crucified him. Now, I think there's a lot here. So, for starters, foreknowledge. Let's talk about foreknowledge for just a second. So, for starters, I guess a question for you is, and I think I know the answer, but I'll go ahead and ask it. So, when you read the word foreknowledge here, do you take it in a sense of either a synonym of determined, or at least implying that the event is determined, and that it couldn't be libertarianly free if it's foreknown? Anything along those lines? Like, basically, is foreknowledge just having this concept of foreknowledge here just enough to make you start to trigger, this is really talking about something that's predetermined?
Um, I I'm not sure. I think that we've talked a little bit in the past about the different ways that we understand the term foreknowledge in Scripture, and I think that I would view this consistently with the other uh, examples of being according to God's love that's that comes before. So not foreknowledge in the sense of uh, prophetic vision or something like that, but foreknowledge in the sense of God loving us ahead of time.
Okay, yeah. So for starters, for everyone that's interested, if they're following along, so um, we debated Romans chapter 8, 28 through 30, and we went over foreknowledge quite a bit there. So there may be a lot of good discussion there. Um, but I guess we don't need to rehash all of that per se. But I think it is important to say that we have a difference, a disconcurrence on the concept of foreknowledge. So I'll recap my version, you can recap yours, and then we don't have to rehash it here. But so in terms of foreknowledge, my main concern is that knowledge is based on the object known, right? So, let's take this coffee mug. I know this coffee mug's here based on the mug, right? The mug is the object of my knowledge. Um, and I think that's important because it can't be unconditional. It can't be not based on the mug. Knowledge is inherently conditional. It cannot be unconditional. And that I have no issue with knowledge or foreknowledge connotating love. It comes alongside, but it's primarily knowledge, or at least it's got to at least include knowledge. So it's knowledge plus love, but it can't be love without knowledge. That doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think that's knowledge, and I don't think that's inconsistent with the biblical usage. So that's my idea of foreknowledge, that it's impossible that it's something that's unconditional. It would be self-contradictory to assert that it is. So that's my view. That's my 2 cents. So what's your take on foreknowledge? I think you already just kind of said it, but what's your take on foreknowledge here?
So yes, I as I said, I think that the I mean, there's I guess there's really only in this particular form of the word, as foreknowledge, as it's distinct from foreknow, the verbal side of it. Uh, this not even the noun form is only used in two places in the New Testament, here and First Peter 1:2, and in both places, I guess there's some, you could say it's open to interpretation whether love is specifically in mind in that sense, and of course, like the word to foreknow potentially could have a broader sense and not be limited only to the kind of loving knowledge. But if, let's say, for the sake of minimizing the number of points to discuss, that we're talking only about knowledge without the additional connotation of it being a loving knowledge or a care or concern. I still don't agree with the idea that the only things that can be known are concrete objects that exist. And I say that because there are, we can give examples of things that are known that don't have a concrete existence or any reality as such as the counterfactuals, So a true counterfactual would be an example of when David asked, "If I stay in the city, will the men of the city give me up?" And the answer to that question is yes. Now, the truth of that statement really is not about a future event where it actually happens, that David actually stays and then David actually gets given up. And we know that because that's not what ended up happening, because David knew that if he stayed, he would be delivered up. Therefore, he didn't stay. And therefore, the situation never did arise. Yet there was still knowledge about the situation, and that knowledge wasn't founded in the existence of that situation. And by the same token, God could have knowledge of some future event, even setting aside whether this has anything to do with God's love, but God can have knowledge of a future event that's not based on the event having or being considered as already going to happen, especially if it's something God's planning. And plans are a great example of how something could be known ahead of time. And there can be a link between the knowledge and the thing, but the link can be exactly the opposite of what you just described. Instead of the knowledge being based on the cup can be based on the knowledge. And that's the typical way in which cups are made, right? Someone first has the idea of what they want to make. They make a plan to do that, and then the cup is the result of the plan, not the other way around. It's not that the person first finds the cup and then makes a plan of how the cup's going to be made. I mean, in the case of making a cup, a concrete item, it's clear that the plan comes first and then the cup follows. And the same is true with the crucifixion of Christ. First, God planned the crucifixion of Christ, and therefore he knew that it was going to happen. And in fact, in this text, in this particular translation, we have plan and knowledge, and the plan explains the knowledge. God knew it was going to happen because he planned it. And there's that there is a link between the two, but the link is from plan to knowledge rather than the opposite, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what I'm proposing is, okay. So I hear what you're saying, and I think I'm going to set aside the issue of middle knowledge for just briefly. I'm sure it'll come back up in the grounding objection and that sort of thing. That's an interesting thought. I wasn't saying that only concrete objects can be known. Obviously, abstract objects can be known too, and counterfactual. I do hold that counterfactuals can be known, but although they're in a slightly different category. Anyways, let me bracket that. So let's focus on the text, right? What I'm proposing is this: that we divide the delivering over of Christ from the crucifixion of Christ. And I know that these two things are close. They're related. They're not unrelated. They are related. Right? And now, if I'm correct about foreknowledge, then having it split like that has some apologetics value, right? God didn't predestine the sin. What he's predestined here is the delivering over to Christ, knowing their attitudes and intentions to kill Jesus, right? And it puts a bit of separation between God and the sin. Yes, he foreknows it, but he didn't predestine it. So
I'm curious about how you're separating delivered up and crucified. Are you suggesting that he's sort of that the delivered up is has a different actor than crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men?
God is the actor of the delivering over, which is basically a permission, but you know, well, okay, so let's take for example, if you um uh, I don't know, let's say like a you're exchanging hostages or something like that, you're delivering the person over. Now, what they do with that person afterwards isn't what you did. You passed them over. Now, maybe they kill him, maybe they release him. I don't know what, but it's a different action than delivering over. So the
Okay,
idea,
hold. Let me pause you right there.
okay,
I think that you've come to this conclusion that the delivering him is something that God does because of a convenient, as kind of a theological convenience.
no, it's because of the
Uh,
text.
and the text in John 19:11, uh, we have in the same English word, and I would be curious if it's the same Greek word, but it says, Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me, except it were given you from above," speaking to Pilate, if I recall correctly. "Therefore, he that delivered me unto you has the greater sin."
So, so,
My,
so
so my question there would be, are you saying that God is the one who delivered Jesus to?
yeah, 100%. So, but different context, and don't context drop. So, what is the subject of delivered in Acts 2:23?
The same as in John 19:11.
It's not God. Hang on. I guess if you look at this as parenthetical, then it's in a kind of a passive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Huh. Let me see. Let me see if a different translation clarifies that. That's an interesting question. It's just passive, isn't it? All right, let's look in the Greek. Okay. Um, aorist subjunctive masculine.
But remember, it's an adjective. It's an adjectival form, right? So it's not.
Him being delivered,
Yeah.
the delivered one. Maybe it'd be a different way to say it, I guess. Well, let's see. Isn't it here saying that that was God's plan, this delivery over?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Then, and God could have prevented it.
God could have prevented it. Jesus made sure it would happen.
Yeah, right. So then I guess I don't see how it could um that we couldn't convert the passive to God delivered him. In fact, I mean I think that's exactly what's I mean, I guess we don't have to convert the passive. He was simply delivered over. But if you're saying that the implication is that um, somebody else delivered him over, that's not here. The implication is that God did it.
God is taking credit for it for sure.
Didn't God deliver Christ over?
God did you I think I'm trying to think if we find that exact expression, God delivered, I don't think we see that exact expression. We do see, you know, the specific actors when it comes to who is the one who delivered. Uh, you see, like just taking John as an example, you know, Pilate delivered him to the soldiers to be crucified in John 19:16. Jesus says, whoever delivers, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin," referring to the Jews, not to not to God. And then in John 18:36, Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of the world. If it were, my servants would fight, so I shouldn't be delivered to the Jews." Uh, in that sense, you know, there's no. Uh, it's not as in that case the negation is a little bit different, but the idea would be that they, you know, those the guards in the garden were the, you know, ones that were delivering him to the Jews. Your Pilate says, "Your own nation and chief priests delivered you to me." Uh, if and they say, "If he were not a malefactor, we wouldn't have delivered him to you." I think in most cases you know, the object uh, the explanation of who's doing the delivering in the Gospels is usually the chief priests and rulers. Although, like I said, occasionally it's like Pilate delivering him to the soldiers. But in like Luke 24, there's several places it says the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and rise the third day. And I'm trying to think. You know, Luke 18, he shall be delivered to the Gentiles. Um, on the other hand, there is like what Luke 10, which says all things are delivered to me of my Father, which I guess you could broadly include the crucifixion in that. So maybe it's one of these both and situations where there's a sense in which it's God's doing, and there's a sense in which it's the doing of men.
So
And yeah.
this John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's giving him over in the context of the snake in the lifting up of the snake in the wilderness. He gave him over to be lifted up.
Yeah. So in other words, I guess it was a long-winded way of saying it's both and. In other words, Jesus is given over, and that's done by the Jews. It's also done by God.
So then the question becomes which is referenced here in this passage. Um, I guess that would be a tough to resolve. And I,
Well, let's say that this is focusing on. I don't have necessarily a big problem with focusing on God uh, delivering. Let's say let's cut through this knot, because I don't want to be just contentious, and maybe it's not provable that this is referring to the same set. I think I kind of just got through saying it could be both and, right?
right.
But that also means it could be either or, I suppose, in the sense that it could be talking about that God delivered up Jesus according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge, as opposed to the Jews delivering him up according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge. But so let's say that it is talking about God delivering him up to the Jews, who then delivered him up to the Romans. And he delivered him up in the sense that he could have sent the angels, and he could have told Peter to keep his or not to sheath his sword. He could have said, "Yeah, go for it, Peter." And Jesus even says, "If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight, so I wouldn't be delivered to the Jews." But he was delivered to the Jews. So in some sense, God delivered him up to the Jews. and the Jews delivered him up to the Romans. And in the same some sense, God also delivered him up to the Romans because God could just as easily have intervened between there, and Jesus could have, Jesus could have called down legions of angels at any point up to the cross. He delivered himself up in that sense, right? He went like a lamb to the slaughter. Are you getting background noise from the next room?
A little bit, not too bad. But
One
yes,
second. Let me see if I can get it down. Sorry about that.
right. Okay.
So where we were at is I was saying let's set aside the question, or let me set aside my reservation about that, and let's say that the first part about him being delivered up is specifically referring to what's God's definitive plan and foreknowledge. I think even if you say that that's only referring to God delivering up Jesus, but it's still part of God. The whole reason for it, the motive for doing that, was for the second part to happen. It's not like God delivered him up like and just, some people seem to think that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was God rolling the dice to see if man was going to sin or not. And unfortunately it came up he was going to sin. And so we have all these other things that come. Well, certainly that's not the idea here. The idea here is that this is all planned. I mean, it's not that he only planned that Jesus is going to get captured by the Jews in the garden, or that he only planned that he's going to be given by the Jews to Pilate. I mean, the whole thing was planned. That's why in advance he said he's going to have to be delivered up to the Gentiles. And I don't know if I can't recall the passage right off the top of my head, but it was, oh yeah, here it is. Um, it says Luke 24 saying the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and rise the third day. He says there it says must. I don't know the underlying Greek for that at this point. And then the other one was somewhere else about the Gentiles, I believe. But
Well, let's
yeah,
let, let's take that because if you look at the turn of the phrase, you crucified and killed him, killed by the hands of lawless men.
right.
The you is the Jewish audience that Peter is addressing here at
Yes.
Pentecost.
Right.
So, um, I still take it a little weird if the idea is you delivered him up and you crucified him, right? Like, it seems more of a plot twist to me, right? I think what Peter is doing is okay. So let's start with the big picture of what I think Peter is doing in this sermon is he is dealing with the fact that the Jesus was crucified on a cross. And he doesn't want to say, you defeated God by doing this. He doesn't want to say, this was a shock to God. He's coming back and saying, no, this was God's plan all along, but you're responsible for it. And you have this blood on your hands, so to speak, that you need to be forgiven of. You need to repent, right? And so the sin that he's laying at their feet is killing Jesus, of crucifying him, of at least instigating the crucifixion. And so that's why I think he's trying to emphasize their responsibility in that by saying you crucified and killed him, or killed him by the hands of lawless men.
Okay.
Um, okay, so let's look at the next one. So there's a similar passage in um, Acts 3, and I want to say it's 18 through 20. It's especially verse 20. Um, but what Jesus foretold by the mouth of all the prophets that this Christ would suffer, he thus fulfilled. Jesus thus fulfilled what the prophets told. Repent therefore and turn back, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus. The appointed for you, Jesus, that's a little bit weird. Let me see if I can get that in a couple different versions so we can get a better sense as to what he's
And he
saying.
shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, is the King James version there.
Yeah,
And the underlying Greek is kai aposteli ton. There's a mouthful. Pro kek he, here's menon. Pro kek here's. I cannot say it well.
yeah,
It's got that kai in the middle. Yeah, pro kek ris menon. That's the verb. And then yeah,
yeah. So preached is this a soft translation for for that verse. Um,
pre-preached, like
yeah, but even pre-preached is not a
because it's
strong.
got that pro anti the pro.
So most of the translations are appointed, appointed, um, appointed, handpicked, appointed in advance, chosen, um, appointed.
So
Uh,
the basically, I mean, maybe we're doing an etymological fallacy here, but I think that it's pro meaning beforehand, and karusu, which is this term that's usually used of some kind of official proclamation. So preached or proclaimed or published. Uh, Appointed might be might be kind of a fair translation as well, but it's appointed in the sense like publicly appointed, like not just nominated, but also confirmed or something like that. I don't know. There you go. There's Strong's. But if you do the if you in Strong's, if you go to the yeah, I think they have that you know John the Baptist was preaching in the wilderness. Jesus began to preach, and this kind of things for the word without the uh, without the pro. You have that
so
it's
it's
often used about the gospel, like as a proclamation of the gospel, but it's partly that's interesting because it seems to be this kind of term that's used uh, for a formal official declaration as distinct from specifically the term evangelize, meaning which is a little different terminology.
okay. So I guess the aspect that's focused on here is um, that his Christ would suffer. That's what was foretold by the mouth of the prophets. Um, but he was preached as Christ was preached as the Messiah. Jesus was preached as the Messiah. Now, see, I think that's where people kind of get to the translation of appointed, um, because it seems weird to say that Jesus was preached to be the Messiah. But let's say it's he's declared to be, or anointed to be, or something maybe a little stronger than preached. But I mean, if you want to, like, okay, so what sense does it make to say that he was preached to be the Messiah, that Jesus was preached to be the Messiah?
Well, like officially, instead of using the word preach, if you say in English, you say proclaimed, like that has a kind of a more formal ring to it. Like if you say he was ahead of time proclaimed to be the Messiah, or like pre-designated the Messiah, or pre-announced as the Messiah. Uh,
Okay, so this is a slightly different word, but the concept I think is going to be similar. Let's look at
see
the Rome.
that Caruso in the
Mhm,
pro and Caruso.
I
You
do.
pick the Caruso. Uh, that has the preaching, that preaching sense to it.
So how about this? So Christ was declared to be the Son of God with power, right?
Yeah,
With horizo,
there you go.
right? The that horizo is ordained, right? That's predetermined, ordained. Sometimes it's declared, but it's mostly defined, marked out beforehand, appointed in that sense. But what does it mean that um, I guess Christ was horizoed to be the
Oh,
Son
in
of
this,
God with
oh,
power?
Caruso
Not
or
Crusoe,
Arizo.
or Horizo.
So we're leaving the Acts 3 passage
Yep.
and just going, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so one of my concerns about this is I do think that there's I think there's a fair, I think declared is a reasonable translation here, but I would say that uh, let's jump. Okay, so let me jump. Let me pull up my Bible as well on the side. Sorry, Romans 1. So in this case, the declaration, or whatever you want to, whatever term you want to use instead of this, the orisment that takes place, is by the resurrection from the dead, and with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead. And in other words, this orizo, that Jesus is the Son of God, is through the instrumentation, or through the instrumentality of the resurrection of the dead. That's the thing that says he is the Son of God. That's that's the the definitive proof of the fact. Yeah, is this and so it might be in this sense it's more of a it's, I don't know, it's a little bit of an um it says, he said he was made of the seed of David, but declared. So it's in contrast to being made in verse 3, uh, made of the seed of David. In that, so that's the seed of David is let's see, according to the flesh.
Sperma. Yeah.
No, well, sperma is the seed, right?
Yeah.
But the made here would be some form of
Get them on.
genomai.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see that. Peri, yeah, genomenon. Genomenon is the word there, but uh, that's like the term was used when Jesus, when the water was made wine or something like that. That has to do with the this incarnation itself, but the declaration, the identification of Jesus as Son of God was through the resurrection from the dead. Is a powerful testimony to his deity. That's Paul's interpretation here in Romans.
So and I think there's a similar concept. It's a different word, pre-preached or whatever, but I think
Mhm.
it's a similar concept here because if Christ is being pre-preached, or Jesus is being pre-preached as Christ, Jesus is being pre-preached as the Messiah. The sense is the same. He's being um, declared to be the Messiah. Um,
So now we're going back to Acts 3 again, right?
right, right. I think the idea is quite similar. I think the idea here is in Acts 3:20 is quite similar because
I th-
in what sense was Christ preached as the Messiah?
hmm.
He's being declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead.
I have another idea for you on that, which
Okay,
is that he's saying something similar to what he said in 18. In
Acts 18?
no, in two verses before, just
Okay.
Acts 3:18, it says, uh, uh, God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, and that foretold there by the mouth of the prophets is, this uh, pro Catanglian or Cantalian. I'm terrible with that. Pro Catanglian. Pro Catanglian. So that's this. It's this idea of, that's actually several things combined, right? But the idea is that he showed it before. I think it's just used in a very synonymous way to that, preceding verse, and referring back to that fact. I think in verse 20. So in other words, the idea is, uh, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with maybe I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, except that I think that he is saying that in advance, God declared this, he showed it, he proclaimed it in advance, that Jesus Christ would suffer, and he fulfilled it. And then verse 19 is a call to repentance. And then verse 20 is saying, and as a result, in response to that repentance, he will send uh, Jesus Christ, who was preached unto you ahead of time. I think at verse 20, he's referring back to that same concept from verse 18 about Christ being foretold.
Wait. So I think this is important. So he's not saying Jesus Christ was preached about. He's saying that Jesus was preached as the Christ.
Um, well, that might be an interesting translational issue. Uh, but I would, well, let me come back to that in a second. And then
Okay.
the other evidence would be, and then in verse 21, sandwiching it in, it says, uh, whom the heavens must receive until the time of restitution of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. So I would think I would tie this comment about being preached before, I would tie that into that same vein of prophetic pre-utterances. So it was pre-stated that he would suffer. It was pre-stated, we could say maybe he was pre-stated that he's the Christ, or just in general that he was coming. That would be the translational difference, I think. And then also that he's going to, at the end of time, uh, restore all things. Come, basically, the last day is coming. And then he gives a specific example in verse 22. Moses truly said to the fathers, and this is, I think, a quotation from Deuteronomy, a prophet like me will be coming, and you should hear everything he says to you. And um, and it goes on. And then again, he goes to illustrate from Samuel and those that followed, foretelling these days. That's verse 24. So I think that I would interpret this 320 consistently with those things in terms of this being a before the events happen, a declaration from, and I would read it as also referring to prophetic utterances that came beforehand. Now, if you mean if the I don't know if your comments are hanging on the question of whether Jesus messiahship is the thing. Uh, but if so, I think it might be a little bit, at least it's hard for me to understand. Could you open that Blue Letter Bible or any of the other ones that have the Greek text for Acts 3:20? Um, and I assume that this is not a variant issue. I know that this Blue Letter Bible usually goes with the TR. Well, actually, you can select, and you have selected the TR because we usually refer to that. But I didn't check in advance to see if there's a difference. Is that the morphological? Is that a different text or is it the same?
The TR is above.
But is the morphological also the TR, or is it just a, is
It
it
is. It
the,
is not. It's the NAS or
okay,
28 or 27 or something. But
okay,
let's see if there's
but
a
it's a
difference.
more recent critical text. But okay, so but this if I'm parsing it, oh, you can't see my my cursor, but if you mouse over the chi in the upper version in the Textus Receptus one,
Okay.
uh, yeah. So obviously that's the and then they he shall send is this apostello, right? The pre-preached, and then uh, the next, I guess it's a pronoun there, is like to you, pre-preached to you, Jesus Christ. I don't see this as, I think that if you're going to start inserting, extra verbs of being into there, it should be just for explanatory purposes, not for translation. In other words, uh, and he will send the one who's been pre-prophesied to you, Jesus Christ, not he will send to you Jesus, who was pre-prophesied to be Christ. At least I don't see that. Maybe I'm totally misunderstanding what you've been saying.
I guess they're both accusative singular masculine. So it does line up that way. I could see that. I because they're both, yeah, it could be that both are the, I guess, the object of the pre-preaching.
Now I have myself very curious if there's any textual variant at Acts 3.
Um I don't see one between perfect middle or singular accusative masculine. No, it seems to line up. At least on that point, it seems to line up.
Okay.
It's interesting that some of the other translations the other way with it. He may send the Christ to you. Look how specific this is. The English Standard Version went out of its way to go that way. Um, so I have a hard time. Look at this. He will send to you Jesus, his chosen Messiah. Right? Like there, that is Yeshua. Um, some of these translations have gone very far out of their way
Huh.
to structure it that way, but doesn't make them right. The translations can be wrong, but I'm very hesitant. But I don't see a grammatical difference yet, because both
No,
of them are accusative singular masculine, so they seem like they could. The only thing,
I
um,
would. I just confirmed that indeed the NA28, the most recent text that I know of on this. Although actually the computer-based method may have hit Axe already. I'm not sure. Anyway, the one I have here, that at least that part of the text is the same.
well, let's okay. So, but let's zoom out. So whatever the answer on that might be, either way, the object of the pre-preaching is Christ, is Jesus at least, right?
Yes.
Right. Now all the other stuff is in there as foreknown, like the sufferings. It's all prophesied about and stuff like that. But the object of this pre-preaching here is Jesus Christ Himself.
Okay.
Okay. So in that sense, it could be similar to the way at least I would take Acts 2:28, that there's a difference between God delivering over Christ and you crucifying Christ. Not you personally, like you being the Jewish audience that Peter was addressing. So I guess I mean, maybe we can move to Acts 4. And Acts 4 is, I'll say, frankly, the big one, right? Like, this is one of the tougher passages for Arminians in the scripture across the board. It seems like it's the go-to text that's used for compatibilism, determinism, that sort of thing. Yeah. So I think it's important. So just let me just read the verse. So it says, starting from verse 27. For truly in this city they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan predestined to take place. Okay, so let's. I'm going to say that there's three different and distinct ways, and they're all similar and they're all really, really close. And so we're going to chop them finely that Arminians have explained this passage. But I'll explain all three of them as best I can. So the one that's going to be probably most similar to Calvinism is that this is talking about predeterminism, and that God predetermined not just that Christ would die, but also that the specific people that killed him would kill him, right? All the Roman soldiers, everything Pontius Pilate did, everything that Judas did, everything that the Sanhedrin did, all of that was predetermined. So that's going to be very much like Calvinism. It's going to use will setting, right?
And say it's an exception or something like that.
And so it's an exception. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Right. And the idea would be, well, they had already made up their minds that they were going to do it. Like the Jews, like it wouldn't be that hard to predict, frankly. They had been trying to kill Jesus. The Jews had been trying to kill Jesus for a long time, like for years. And they just. Sorry, go ahead.
Quick cross-exam question.
Okay.
For this view, which I assume the way you phrased it, it's not your view.
I'm open to it. I think I probably would take more of a middle knowledge approach myself personally. But
okay.
Go ahead.
But assuming
I'm sorry. Let me step back. Let me caveat. With Judas, yes, I think Judas is like this because it says specifically that Satan entered him. So I can't imagine that that's. I have a hard time accepting that Judas had free will if Satan literally possessed him. So with Judas, yeah, it's something like will setting. But with the others, let's say,
Now, are you denying that Satan has free will?
No, but I don't know that Judas necessarily had free will in this case.
So it would be, in that case, it would still be the question of, even if Judas is just Satan's puppet, for the sake, a hand puppet or sock puppet or whatever.
Yeah.
But even if he's Satan's puppet, well, still Satan's free will would be implicated. So
okay,
you wouldn't have will
yeah.
setting in the sense that you're talking about, right? In that sense, like in a full sense. So maybe Judas's will is set, but Satan's will is not.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's right. And I am saying I don't think. I think, like, let's say for example, the soldiers, whether they, the number of stripes that they hit Jesus with. I think God knew exactly that number. I think it was the number that God wanted it to be, but I think they had free will and that they could have, hit him one more time or one less time or something like that, if that makes sense.
It reminds me of a song that I'm not going to repeat here. But so whether or not it's I thought it wasn't your view, or at least not your view with respect to the crucifixion as in general, that everybody involved was just not using their wills. For those people who do hold this position, how do you deal with the greater Jesus' comment about who has the greater sin? Would the idea be that there isn't a link between free will and sin, such that people can have their wills set, but they can still commit sin while their wills are set?
No, okay. So let's take drunk driving, right? Like, even if at the moment you're driving drunk, you're not able to make that left turn, and you end up plowing somebody over. You're still responsible for it because you made that choice to drink and drive, or whatever the case might have been. And let's even back up and take the example of Satan. So we talked about, okay, well, Judas was possessed by Satan, but maybe Satan was so full of hatred that he couldn't do otherwise than have Christ crucified, and just God just knew that. So it could be will setting without middle knowledge, whole cloth. There's no reason why not, at least not logically, and
Well,
it still doesn't get to determinism across the board.
I see the idea, at least on some logical level. You could have will setting as a fallback from middle knowledge. In other words, there could be no feasible world where middle knowledge gives you the result that God wants. Therefore, God, in some places, takes away that freedom, so that will setting is used instead of freedom, and therefore God gets what He wants that way by making exceptions to free will. So, whether God's doing this will setting based on a middle knowledge, or whether He's doing it based only on some other uh, basis, seems like it's a little bit irrelevant to the question. I guess I guess you're saying that, if I heard your answer though correctly, your answer was that the sinfulness of the crucifixion, would still be taught. They would still be responsible for the crucifixion because their will was set as a punishment for something previous, and that previous thing not only makes them guilty for the previous thing they did, but also for all the things they do as a result of this judicial hardening or will setting or whatever it is.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Hmm.
So, actually, you said something really interesting. So I'll comment on it. So I think will setting, um, compared to middle knowledge, will setting is both stronger and weaker. It's stronger in the sense of it's an actual determinate event. It's not something that's done freely with libertarian freedom, but it's weaker in a providential sense. So, like when you look at middle knowledge, in the complaint is usually, well, there's all these billions of possible worlds, and God knows what anyone would, what Santa Claus would do under this and that circumstance. So it just seems like there's so many different possibilities. Where will setting, no, that's based on the habits and character that people have formed throughout their lives. So it's almost like God has counterfactual knowledge based on will setting, but it's not counterfactuals of freedom. It's determined counterfactuals based on um, a person's habits and character forming moments. So it's a much smaller pool of this counterfactual knowledge that God has. So it gives God um, a smaller set of providential control, but when the event happens, when God's using a will set event, it's predetermined rather than free. If that does that make sense?
I'm not sure it makes more. I think I follow. Let me put it this way. I think I follow the explanation. I
Yeah.
don't think that all of the explanation. I don't think it forms a cohesive system.
Okay.
But I think I follow the explanation. Then again, maybe the problem is I don't understand it, and that's why I think it doesn't work. But we'll have to
Okay.
leave open that possibility.
So okay. So now let's say, for the sake of argument, that it's neither will setting nor, well, I guess let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's not will setting. So
Okay.
here's the other position that Arminians have taken on this passage, which is a very similar approach that I've taken on Acts 2 and Acts 3. But there's a grammatical question to resolve. There's a to do, which is an infinitive, to do whatever your hand and your plans had predestined to take place. The question is, who is doing the to do, right? And the question is it Jesus, or is it Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and Israel? Who's the actor? Who's doing the to do? And I think, at least when I looked at it, and I looked at it pretty deeply, it's hard to tell. Grammatically, it could be either one. There are translations that do make it sound more like it's Jesus. Um, let's take, for example, this is the Net translation. It moves the whom you appointed after your holy servant, after the Gentiles, after the people, after Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and it says, for indeed Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel assembled together in this city against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed to do as much as your power and your plan had decided beforehand would happen. With this,
Oh,
with
the the power of a comma, though. Without the comma, then it would look like anointed to do. But with that little comma,
then it goes back to Jesus. Or
no,
it could go back to Jesus, which is the point. Which is the point that it's Jesus was predestined to do certain things.
what?
What do you
How
mean?
would it
What?
go back to Jesus?
Because it's the closest noun. It's the closest thing that could be a subject.
Uh, I think Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, assembled together in this city, right, against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, against Jesus to do as much as your power and plan had decided before would happen. I don't see how that would work.
I
There's
think I
like,
see your question. Yeah. So if you, I mean, obviously you're right. So it's the comma. So if he was anointed to do those things, um, or yeah, if he was anointed to do those things, like essentially, save humanity, um, or there become the basis of salvation or something like that,
or to
th-
die. Yeah.
to die, um, then it would make sense. But if it's not saying that he was anointed to do, if it's not saying that Jesus was anointed to do those things, then I guess it would make less sense. There was one other here. There was somebody else that took this approach. Let me find it. Here, I'll pull this up. There was actually a comment in Myers that I thought was interesting. But let me go to Clark real quick because he made the same point, but he made it in almost too strong a way. And I saw what he was saying, but I'm not sure I agreed with him. But let me just throw it on the table for clarity. The way he's analyzing the text.
Uh, did you think you went past it? No. Oh, I saw it again. There you go.
Okay, so here's his comment. There's a parenthesis in the verse that is not sufficiently noticed. It should be read in connection with Acts 4:28. So he's talking about Acts 4:27. Um, for of a truth against your holy child Jesus, whom you anointed, parenthesis, for to do whatever your hand and your counsel determined beforehand done, comma, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and people of Israel were gathered together.
So that one with the parenthetical instead, uh,
Yeah.
it says, "For of a truth against your child Jesus, uh, whom you anointed." And there he is saying that the anointing is to do whatever was appointed to be done. Both these people were gathered together. Interesting.
Yeah. So if that's the case, then it's Jesus that's the doer, and God has anointed Jesus to do certain things.
Well, I'm curious. What is I should know by now, but who is which this particular Clark? What's his theological
Oh,
preference? Is he a Calvinist? Is he an Arminian? Or is he a Romanist? What is his?
good question. So he is a Methodist theologian, so more Arminian. However, I will
Like a
bring,
Wesleyan Arminian? Or
yeah, yeah.
okay.
However, I will bring in a hostile witness. That's a perfect segue.
Well, no, no. I
But
mean,
but
I don't
not
want to. I'm not trying to discredit him on that basis.
yeah.
Though obviously that would, kind of explain why he's saying, no one else has noticed this but me. If that's what he's saying, the way he says it's often overlooked sometimes that's a way of saying nobody noticed this but me. But that's not necessarily means it's wrong. That just it might be why he noticed it. I mean, sometimes that helps to, it helps to notice things, having a particular point of view. I do wonder whether it's a viable interpretation. And it doesn't, I'm not sure if did you check other translations? There's some drop down where you can look at like dozens of translations, right? For the
Yeah,
verse.
you can, but it's like really the issue spans two verses, like 27, 28. So you kind of have to do it one by one. Um,
Mm,
so, but here, let me bring this up. So I saw this when I was reading Meyer's commentary. Now, Myers himself, I think, is actually, I'm not sure what Myers is, but anyways,
mhm.
it's not about Myers. It's about Beza. Beza
Theodore
looks at,
Beza.
yeah, Beza looks at the make in verse, um, let's see,
I just read it.
verse 27. And so what he says, Beza says that
That it's the
uh,
assembly that was to do all the things. The council,
it refers not to basically to Herod's will or a choice,
but the
but
event of the
but
council.
but the event of the council,
Not
right?
the council and the will of Herod, but to the event of the council.
Right, the result.
I
And,
don't know. I don't have Flacius, do I? I think I do. Why? Good grief, that is hard to find.
but I mean, if if Clark is tainted because he's a Methodist,
No, 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 no.
Beza's
I shouldn't
not.
have. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up in the context of this discussion,
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
it does sound like I'm saying, "Oh, well, you can't believe him. He's a Methodist." I literally just didn't know. I mean, I
Yeah,
know that
sure,
you
sure.
often do quote from Calvinists, and I was curious to get more of a
Yeah,
more of a background on it. And certainly, I would not say that we have to just write off anybody's exegesis because it might possibly be motivated by their bias, because then why look at commentaries at all? I mean, ultimately it's about the strength of their argument, uh, and I am curious. I'm very curious actually whether anyone puts it in parentheses. Any translation committees have put it in parentheses like that, or if eh, but maybe so. I mean, maybe they have. But how? Let's go back to maybe I don't know. There's two things. Are you going to all English translations? Uh, let's see. Uh,
see, the problem is they could just use commas.
well, I mean, some could. I mean, some translations use parentheses for like in this city in the JUB translation. They use
Yeah,
and as you said, it does kind of span them. Maybe let's just. I'm trying to think if I can do it on my screen in parallel. That the way you got to it was through the Bible Gateway.
yeah,
That the
yeah. If
and
you
then
look up a single verse in Bible Gateway, then it says like look up all the translations for it.
I found it. I'm going there now, and I'm just going to go and do a quick. There's 76 parentheses. That's good grief.
Just a quick,
That's
yeah.
but let's see. I mean, mm, well, no, but most of them are actually just in the footnotes. So there's nobody who's using parentheses per se. But let me try on 28 and see. Uh, see if there's any. Uh,
I think the net is the closest to, even though it uses commas rather than parentheses, it's basically doing the same thing, I
well, I
think.
think with the word order that we were just talking about, I don't think you can interpret it as lining up with the parenthetical reading.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that it doesn't. I'm like, whatever. I'm not sure. Uh, it is interesting though. Some of in these it does break. It's one of the less convenient times for the versification because it breaks right across the boundary between 27 and 28.
Right.
Some of them seem to a lot of some of the translations will end the sentence in oh my goodness, the Phillips translation, my word, I'm sorry. So I'm getting distracted a little bit. The shiny object of looking at all of these different translations.
Like
I
when
was
they just went on and on and on. That's not a translation. That's something else.
that I don't know what's that. It seems like it's the there is the part in the middle for truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate and all these other were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. That part of it is the translation. For some reason, it's just not. They don't. Phillips just said forget the versification, and somebody who was parsing it couldn't figure out how to parse Phillips in an automated way, and so they just like somehow grabbed the whole paragraph. I think. I guess. I mean, it's my wild guess. Um, but there is a little section, a nugget in the middle. Uh, well, anyway, I guess the thing is, if I don't agree with Clark's idea that this is, I don't agree with his interpretation, but at least it's an alternative view, is to say that this is a parenthetical, and that the way to interpret it is as that Jesus was anointed to do all these things, and and I guess in some cases, maybe, I mean, it's hard. It is really hard if the people are, if any of the translating committees are using commas to indicate the parenthetical instead of using parentheses. It's really hard to pick that up. And the versification biases the question a little bit because the translation committees are, they generally do try to preserve the words of the translation matching up with the words of the verse. There's a few cases I've seen where they will like allow themselves the freedom to grab a couple of words in the next verse and pull them into the previous verse. We're kind of the versification is pretty hard for them in most cases for them to resist, and they'll just stick with their versification. And if you use that versification, it does end up looking in most cases like um, I guess the more, the 28 referring to the 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 council or the assembly, uh, it says to do what was determined before to be done. And huh, my goodness, some of these are very, very free translations. Uh, the closest one might be the Message, but it's a little bit ambiguous. The Message in 28 says, met in this very city to plot against your holy son Jesus, the one whom you made Messiah, to carry out the plans you long ago set in motion. It's sort of ambiguous, but again, the comma would tend to favor the other reading. So interesting. I don't know. Clark's comments is fascinating. I just wish that there was some more explanation for why he feels that it's a parenthetical.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's why I hesitated when I read. I think I think he's making a point that I've seen made many, many, many times, but I think he overstated how certain he is about it. I think that has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, let's play it out. Let's say he's right. Then we come back to this schema, and what we could say is, what Christ did was predestined, but the way it happened was flexible. Somebody else could have, been involved with the crucifixion. There could have been a different number of soldiers. There could have been, maybe it wasn't even a crucifixion. Maybe, he was killed in some other way. Um, there's a lot of that allows the actions of the crucifiers, the people that were directly involved, to be free, but not just free, but flexible, fungible. Like it could have been different, and um, things could would have changed, but the event, the outcome was predetermined. What Christ did would be predetermined.
So there's a term for this,
Yeah.
fatalism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. So like one aspect is locked down, but the other aspects
It's like
are
there's this
free.
push pin on
Free.
Jesus is definitely going to die.
Yeah,
How exactly it happens? Eh,
Yeah,
but it's definitely going to happen.
that's fatal. Yeah, I tend to agree. Yeah, it's like who's the one that uh kills his father and marries his mother? Uh, whatever.
Oedipus.
Oedipus. Yeah, yeah. So he like spends the whole story trying to avoid that prophecy, and he ends up doing it, by accident or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it sounds. I guess it could sound there's not there's some similarities there. Yeah, in that specific reading.
So I'll also, I mean, in terms of there's a lot more. There are a lot of details that are prophesied about Christ's crucifixion. That he'll be lifted up like the serpent was in the wilderness. Some of these are Jesus' own prophecies in the Gospels. Not all of them are Old Testament prophecies. And some are Old Testament prophecies that were very much veiled before Christ explained them, like the serpent in the wilderness. The extent to which that is a model of Christ wasn't clear, as clear, let's say, at the time of Moses, 2,000 years before Christ. Versus when Christ said, the Son of Man must be lifted up, like the serpent was in the wilderness, at that point, it's pretty much, he has to be lifted up. I mean, he's not going to die by being stoned or thrown off a cliff or suffocated. He's going to be crucified. Uh, and then, it's not appropriate that a prophet should die outside of Jerusalem, meaning in some other city except for Jerusalem. So it's the location is pinned down, the mode of execution is pinned down. I don't remember. I think he may have prophesied as well that it would be by the Gentiles, or there's a lot that's really specifically pinned down, and I, I don't I don't know if there's that much wiggle room. Even if someone wants to say that there's a lot of flexibility, there's not that much wiggle room in terms of by the time that you come to past the Last Supper, and Jesus is saying, "What you do quickly." It's kind of like he's pretty much everything is already pinned down,
Well, except the color of sandals that the soldiers wore. I mean, yeah, yeah,
or the
yeah.
number of stripes. I mean, but
Right.
even so,
Yeah, right. So it, here's the thing. Okay, so let's set that aside. Let's say it's not that way. Let's say it's a middle knowledge or it's will setting or something like that, in that those specific events were pre-orzo, the what the soldiers did and that sort of thing.
mhm.
Um, what I want to make sure that it's held clear is that, especially in the middle knowledge view, the mode doesn't have to be locked in. So let's say, for example, the prophecy that Christ's legs wouldn't be broken. That doesn't mean that Christ's legs were made out of adamantium rather than bones, right? It's just in the way God arranged it. And it's the same way with the human will. It's not that, a libertarian free will had to necessarily become determined. Now, it could be if will setting is the case, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's just God knowing what people would freely do, put them in those circumstances that He did it, and He doesn't have to convert the bones to adamantium, nor does He have to, um, convert the wills of human beings into stones or whatever.
That's a very. I got distracted at first because I started going on my mentally. I was trying to think, well, are Wolverine's bones really replaced by adamantium, or they're kind of just reinforced with adamantium? I got distracted for a while by that,
Sure.
and ultimately his bones break, but they reheal really quickly and easily, or something like that. I got distracted by that, I admit.
Okay.
Once I came back to reality and to the point you're making, I think I basically agree that uh, just taking as a great example, not a bone will be broken. In a sense, it made Jesus, legs unbreakable. In a sense, they're unbreakable, but not in the sense that they're too hard to break. Like the Roman soldiers are sitting there like, we're gonna break these legs, or they're smashing them with the ancient equivalent of a baseball bat, and there's the bat's just doing nothing. Like there's some bruises, but the bones are not going anywhere. That's not what scriptures prophesied. Although God could have protected Jesus' bones that way if he wanted to, he could have calcified them and made them super strong and were super resilient. They're like rubber and nothing could break them because there's no tool that could break them. And God has sometimes used some kind of supernatural means for accomplishing things. So when Jesus hid himself walking through the midst of them, perhaps he was cloaked in some way so that people physically could not see him. Or maybe he just slip through using the ordinary way that people can slip through a crowd without, because people get confused in the process and so forth. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us that answer on that particular case. But when it comes to his bones not being broken, the way that God made that happen is that Jesus died quickly before the time would have come for his bones to be broken. And so the Roman soldiers didn't break his bones, not because they couldn't from the standpoint of the mechanics of how to break bones, but they didn't need to because he was already dead, right? And I've actually heard
It's essentially persuasion. Yeah.
uh, sort of a persuasive aspect. Their wills weren't. It's not that Jesus or that God the Father or the Holy Spirit or Jesus had to go there and persuade, like argue with the soldiers and change their minds about breaking his legs. It wasn't even that they had to, uh, you know, do one of those what was it, Frankfurt experiments, where they're about to use their free will, and so they
Yeah.
zap them with the will setting exception. And there's not it's not that at all. There's a way around their will, which is now that he's already dead, they have no motivation to break his legs. It's extra work for them. And on on any account, his legs were unbreakable only in the sense that God arranged so that they wouldn't be broken, not in the sense that he had made them too hard to break or something like that. But the same, if we accept, and when we accept that, we can also accept the idea that God's ways of determining other things to happen could be done without, or let's say it this way. So the case of Jesus' legs not being broken is an example of God's foreordination occurring without any harm to the will of the soldiers. He didn't have to overcome their wills or replace their will with a different will or zap them. There was no harm done to their will. They still had a free will in whatever sense human beings have free wills, but they, but nevertheless, they did what God had foreordained would happen, and namely, in this case, it's a negative, but not breaking Jesus' bones. And he did that without any violence to their will, which is the Calvinist view, as well as the middle knowledge view, in terms of the way that God accomplishes those things. And I guess it's useful in the sense that it highlights that both the middle knowledge view and the Calvinist view affirm that men make free choices. In other words, it's not that the Calvinists wouldn't say that these men had their force, that these men's choices were somehow less free than other choices that people normally make. But nevertheless, it was determined in advance what that choice would be. And in this case, it was determined through having Jesus die quickly and avoid the leg breaking that the robbers or the brigands apparently suffered. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Or
It does. I mean, I think I want to. Okay, so I think the discussion could get pretty philosophical here, but I think it's basically down to, is it the combination that's impossible, or is it the that the fact that the agents don't have, you know, contracausal freedom, or they can't cause alternative things to happen, right? Those are so I think, and I know we're running low on time. So philosophically, what I would love to get into is this whole issue of foreknowledge and whether it implies determinism, because in essence, I think you have a problem with middle knowledge in general, right? Like,
I have a problem with the idea that middle knowledge crops up into existence out of nothing and not from God. That I do have a problem with that.
so If
I,
that, let's say you're right. Let's say there is no middle knowledge. It would push me towards more of a will setting type explanation. On the other hand, if it's middle knowledge, then these things could have happened freely. But I think either way, um, unless I'm missing something, what's the argument from here to get to everything is determined, including the color of the sandals of the Romans? I mean, how do we get there?
wow. In 30 seconds or less.
Yeah, go, go, go.
Well, I suppose the short answer is that by itself, this doesn't, even if, let's say, the crucifixion is preordained, that by itself wouldn't prove that everything else is preordained. Although quite a lot goes into the crucifixion, so we're talking about quite a lot of things that have to be foreordained in order for the crucifixion to be foreordained, at least in terms of all the numerous prophecies that took place, most of all, or uh, most obviously, the Daniel's 70 weeks prediction, including Christ's death as part of that, if assuming that you take that view of the 70 weeks, in that case, pretty much you have to have all 70 weeks or up to whatever point in the 70 weeks Jesus' death is, you have to have them all more or less all foreordained, because you can't have I mean, in order for it all to kind of play out the way that's prophesied, it all pretty much has to go exactly as prophesied. And if there's some flexibility or something else, then you run into some sticky situation. Although I guess you can then kind of mix things together and say, well, some things that are prophesied are just kind of predicted or announced ahead of time based on foreseen futures or something like that. And then some of the things in the future are foreordained. But that hybrid of some things being just foreseen and then other things being planned, that creates some weird logical issues. But you know, so setting everything aside of all that question of uh, whether the extent to which this implies more, it's certainly reasonable for Calvinists to concede that by itself, that kind of statement wouldn't inherently require that all of history be similarly foreordained, that all of history be similarly predestined. And in fact, there's that would so in other words, you could try to become a fatalist about the crucifixion and have a different view about the rest of history, or leaving aside whatever trail has to be present in order for the crucifixion to happen in that fatalistic way. But the there are so you have to basically find some other aspects, and some of those other aspects are things like God's care for humanity, God's discussion of the elect, his the connection between predestination in the passages we just talked about and in Romans 8, and uh, there's probably a number of other links, but I would say probably the best place to make that connection would be to go from the parts we just discussed and say, okay, well, in the case of the crucifixion, it was foreordained. But let's say that we persuade someone to that point, and they say, well, but maybe it was just the crucifixion that's foreordained. But then we go to Romans 8, and then we say, well, Romans 8 is making it look like uh, it's more than just the crucifixion. It's all believers. And if it's on all believers, well, maybe it doesn't say anything about the unbelievers, but at some point that's starting to look a little bit thin, for that same reason that if the crucifixion is planned, there's this whole ripple of other things. Like what happens in about the Aztecs or the Mesoamerican tribes probably doesn't have a whole lot of bearing on what's going on in Palestine in the first century, right? So the empires in what we call the New World at that time, they don't have if we're talking about fatalism or something like that, doesn't really matter in that sense. But if we're talking about future believers, Well, there's people who believe whose ancestry is from from all over the planet. It's not just limited to people from Palestine. So it's important whether some ancestor of mine, let's say that I mean, somehow maybe someday I'll prove exactly what's my ancestry. But let's say there's some North American or South American uh, indigenous ancestor of mine. If they had gotten killed off, I wouldn't be here. If they
But
got killed off before, so so
so
it does matter. Quite a lot matters just on the idea of believers. So
okay. So let me and I know we have to wrap for time. So
sorry.
let me put it this way. I think maybe we have two different episodes being created here. One in which you make the argument or case that if I go down the will setting path and say this is predetermined, that it's going to blossom out and just be disastrous for my position. And the other is I have to make a case that God's foreknowledge is reconcilable with libertarian free will, and that the middle knowledge truly is an option here. So, do you think those two would be maybe good episodes that we could do at some point?
I definitely think an episode on middle knowledge on the grounding objection, I think that would be definitely be worth some discussion, because something we've talked about offline, I think, at some points.
Sure,
It comes up sometimes in debates. It would be a nice topic to have a kind of back and forth on.
sure.
It's a little bit philosophical, but it would still be good. So
Okay, very good. Cool. And but would you also be willing to, what you've just talked about for the last like 3 minutes, just kind of flesh it out? So maybe cite the exegetical evidence and the arguments in terms of, well, if the crucifixion was predestined, you end up basically with so much being predestined, you might as well just give up.
yeah, it seems like, well, I would say for, yeah,
Okay.
if it's just if it's just the crucifixion, then you have to deal with other passages that seem to have a similar view about other things. And then if you extend it to being the not only the crucifixion but also uh, believers, it becomes really hard to have will setting of believers pinned down unless you guarantee their whole genealogy. And to guarantee their whole genealogy, you're controlling so much of history at that point that uh, you might as well just not call it an exception anymore. Now it's the rule.
Just pack it in. Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Sounds like a plan. I appreciate it. It's been really good talking with you as always.
Yeah, likewise.
God be with you.
And with you.